You know, there's this specific kind of silence that only happens in a room full of people who think they're better than you. It's heavy, it's cold, and it tastes like expensive cologne and stale coffee, and I was kneeling right in the middle of it, picking up the shattered pieces of a $30,000 architectural model while the CEO of the most prestigious firm in the city looked down at me like I was something he'd just scraped off the bottom of his Italian leather loafers. My name is Elias Vance, but to the people at Sterling and Associates, I was just the guy in the gray jumpsuit, the invisible shadow who emptied their trash cans and mopped the marble floors at 3 a.m. And honestly, I was okay with being invisible because it's easier to hide your scars when no one's looking. But that morning, everything changed when Julian Sterling, a man who'd never known a day of hunger in his life, decided to kick a piece of broken acrylic toward my bleeding hand and told me to clean up the trash. Before the real talent arrives, I didn't say a word. I just kept my head down, feeling the sting of a fresh cut on my thumb as I gathered the fragments of what was supposed to be the Aura Tower, a project that was currently bleeding the firm dry because their lead architect, a trust fund kid named Preston Thorne, couldn't figure out why the foundation specs kept failing the stress tests, and the irony of it all was burning a hole in my chest because while I was bagging up their failure, I could see the blueprints laid out on the conference table, and even from the floor, I could see exactly where Preston had screwed up the load-bearing calculations. See, 5 years ago, I was 3 months away from graduating top of my class at MIT with a master's in structural engineering. But then my world collapsed when my kid brother, Leo, got diagnosed with a rare heart condition, and the choice between a degree and a life-saving surgery for the only family I had left wasn't even a choice. So I traded my slide rule for a mop, took a job that kept me under the radar, and spent my nights studying by candlelight in a crumbling apartment, because the power company doesn't care about potential when the bills are 3 months past due. As I was hauling the trash out, the heavy glass doors swung open and in walked Marcus Vane, a billionaire developer who didn't have time for excuses, followed by a team of engineers who looked like they were ready to pull the plug on the whole $80 million deal. And Julian Sterling went from being a tyrant to a total suck-up in 3 seconds flat, plastering on this fake, oily smile and promising that the minor structural hiccups were already being handled by his top minds. Vane wasn't buying it though. He just stood there with his arms crossed, looking at the empty pedestal where the model used to be, and then he looked at me, standing there with a trash bag in one hand and blood dripping from my thumb, and he asked Sterling if this was the kind of precision he could expect from the rest of the project, to which Preston Thorne, the lead architect, just laughed and said, "Don't mind the help, Mr. Vane. Some people are just born to handle the leftovers of greatness." And that little comment sent a ripple of snickers through the room that made my vision go blurry. With a mix of shame and pure, unadulterated rage, I retreated to the shadows of the supply closet, my heart hammering against my ribs in a rhythm that felt like a ticking clock. Because I knew things they didn't. I knew that the land Sterling was trying to build on was sitting on a subterranean silt pocket that would liquefy the moment they hit the 24th floor. And I also knew that the very same development company was the one currently trying to bulldoze my neighborhood to build a luxury parking garage, essentially trying to render me homeless while I cleaned their toilets. I sat there in the dark, surrounded by the smell of bleach and ammonia, and I realized that being good and patient had gotten me exactly nowhere. My brother needed his next round of meds. My landlord was sticking an eviction notice on my door tomorrow morning. And the men upstairs were about to kill people with a building that was destined to fall, all while patting themselves on the back for their brilliance. That night, the city felt like it was closing in on me. The rain was coming down in these thick, heavy sheets that made the old windows in my studio rattle. And since the electricity had been cut off for 2 days, I was working by the flicker of a few half-burnt tea lights, my fingers moving almost on instinct as I used my grandfather's old drafting tools to rebuild the Aura Tower from memory. It's funny how numbers work. They don't care about your bank account or the color of your skin. They just are what they are. And as I worked through the calculus of the wind shear variables and the soil density coefficients, the solution just started to bloom on the paper. Elegant and simple, and so incredibly obvious that it hurt. I spent hours refining it, pouring every ounce of the architect I was supposed to be into those sketches, signed not with the name of a janitor, but with the title I had earned in my soul, Elias Vance, lead engineer. And for a moment, in that dark, cold room, I wasn't a guy struggling to survive. I was a creator. The next morning, the air at the office was thick with a different kind of tension. The news had leaked that the city council was investigating Sterling and Associates for safety shortcuts, and the stock price was cratering, which meant everyone was looking for a scapegoat. And of course, Preston Thorne was nowhere to be found, probably hiding in his corner office trying to figure out how to blame the clumsy janitor for the missing files he'd actually lost himself. I saw an opening when Clara, the only junior architect who ever looked me in the eye, left her workstation to go to a frantic emergency meeting, and with my heart in my throat, I slipped my finished, corrected designs onto her desk, hidden under a pile of discarded drafts, just a silent gift from the trash man that could save $80 million and countless lives, if someone just had the sense to look. I spent the rest of the day watching the chaos from the periphery, pushing my cart past glass-walled offices where grown men were shouting at each other and throwing folders, and I couldn't help but feel this grim sort of satisfaction, like I was a ghost watching a haunted house burn down. But then I saw Preston walk out of Clara's office with my papers in his hand, and for a second, I thought maybe, just maybe, he'd do the right thing and admit he needed help. Instead, I watched him walk straight into Julian Sterling's office, close the blinds, and 10 minutes later, a cheer went up from the executive floor. Preston had miraculously solved the foundation problem, and suddenly he was the golden boy again, the hero who'd saved the firm from the brink of disaster, while I was told to go clean up the champagne spills in the break room. That was the moment the last bit of nice guy in me finally snapped. I realized that in their world, you don't get what you deserve, you get what you take. And if they wanted to steal my brain, they were going to have to deal with the consequences of not knowing how the rest of the engine worked. See, I'd intentionally left out the secondary seismic dampening specs, the failsafe that kept the Buell ding from swaying like a blade of grass in a hurricane, and without those, the Aura Tower wasn't a masterpiece. It was just a very expensive, very tall guillotine, and the only person who could stop the blade from falling was the man they'd spent the last year treating like a piece of furniture. As I mopped up the expensive bubbly they were drinking to celebrate my stolen work, I caught Preston's reflection in the glass. He looked smug, untouchable, but I just smiled to myself because I knew something he didn't. The billionaire, Marcus Vane, was coming back tomorrow for the final sign-off, and he wasn't bringing his checkbook. He was bringing his own independent auditors, and they were going to ask questions that Preston Thorne couldn't answer, even if his life depended on it. The morning of the final presentation felt like the air before a lightning strike. Everything was too quiet, too still, and the lobby of Sterling and Associates was filled with the kind of forced energy that makes your skin crawl. Julian Sterling was pacing back and forth, adjusting his silk tie every 30 seconds, while Preston Thorne stood near the new model of the Aura Tower, looking like a man who had just won the lottery but forgotten where he hid the ticket. I was in the corner, ostensibly polishing the brass railings, but my eyes were locked on the elevator doors, waiting for Marcus Vane to step out and start the countdown to the most satisfying explosion of my life, because I'd spent the previous night not just crying over my brother's medical bills, but recording a time-stamped video of myself explaining every single calculation on those stolen sheets, using my grandfather's compass as a pointer, proving exactly who the real architect actually was. When the elevator finally pinged and Vane stepped out, he wasn't alone. He had 3 of the most stone-faced structural inspectors the city had to offer, and you could practically see the sweat start to bead on Preston's forehead through his $500 haircut. They all marched into the main conference room, the one with the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the very skyline. I was destined to change, and Julian Sterling started his song and dance about innovation and overcoming adversity, gesturing to the blueprints, my blueprints, as if they were holy relics he'd personally birthed. I moved closer, heart hammering, pushing my cleaning cart just outside the open double doors, close enough to hear every word, close enough to see the trap snap shut. One of the inspectors, a woman with graying hair and eyes like a hawk, pointed to the foundation slab design and asked a very specific question about the lateral load distribution, the kind of question that requires you to actually understand the physics, not just read the numbers off a page. And Preston started to stammer, throwing out buzzwords like synergy and advanced stabilization that meant absolutely nothing. The room went dead silent, and I could see Marcus Vane's expression shift from impressed to deadly, his eyes narrowing as he realized the man in the designer suit didn't have a clue what he was talking about. And that's when Julian Sterling, desperate and cornered, looked around the room for someone to blame, and his eyes landed right on me. Standing there with my mop. "You," he shouted, pointing a trembling finger at me. "Janitor, didn't I tell you to clear out? Your incompetence is distracting my lead architect." It was a pathetic move, a classic kick the dog tactic to buy time, but it backfired in a way he never could have imagined, because Vane looked at Sterling, then at the stammering Preston, and then he looked at me, and he saw the way I was looking at the blueprints, not with confusion, but with a cold, analytical clarity, and he asked me, "What do you see when you look at those plans, son?" Julian tried to interject, calling me a diversity hire who barely knew how to read, but Vane held up a hand to silence him, and for the first time in 5 years, I stepped over the threshold into the light, my voice steady and low as I told the room, "I see a building that's going to collapse the moment the wind hits 40 miles an hour, because the man holding the pen forgot to account for the secondary harmonic resonance of the silt pocket beneath the bedrock." The silence that followed was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. Preston tried to laugh it off, calling me a crazy person who'd spent too much time huffing floor wax, but the inspectors were already leaning in, their eyes darting between me and the schematics, and the hawk-eyed woman asked, "How do you know about the silt pocket?" I reached into my pocket, pulled out my old mid-ID card, the one I'd kept like a lucky charm even through the darkest days, and laid it on the table right next to the stolen plans. And I told them, "I know, because I'm the one who wrote these notes. I'm the one who did the math, and if you look at the bottom left corner of page 12, you'll find a microscopic watermark made with a dry-point compass, my grandfather's compass, that spells out my name in Braille, a little trick I use to make sure my work is never truly stolen." The look on Julian Sterling's face was worth more than any paycheck I'd ever received. It was the look of a man who realized he'd been treating a king like a beggar while letting a court jester run his king demand. Marcus Vane, without a word, walked over to the table, looked at the corner of page 12, and then looked at me with a grim, respect-filled nod. He turned to his inspectors and said, "Get this trash out of my sight," and for a glorious second, Julian thought he was talking about me, until Vane pointed his finger directly at Julian and Preston and told them to pack their things before he called the police for fraud and reckless endangerment. The aftermath was a whirlwind. Sterling and Associates folded within a month, their reputation incinerated by the scandal, and Preston Thorne ended up losing his license and his father's trust, which honestly felt like poetic justice. But the real kicker was when Marcus Vane offered me a position as the head of his new urban development firm, with a salary that paid for Leo's surgery in full.